Hi, this is John Allard, and this is a combined blog for Milton Keynes Beating the Coronavirus, and also the pro-longevity blog that I've been doing. Just for background, I've been working with a well-known pharmacist. He's known as the pharmacist who gave up drugs. And I'd like to introduce Graham Phillips. Graham, how are you?
Hi, John. Yes, good. How are you?
Well, I think a lot better than I was going back a few weeks ago when we started the program.
Yeah,
Um,
it kind of feels like we've woken up into some kind of dystopian reality, doesn't it?
yeah, I think you're absolutely right, but I think more personally, I was not particularly healthy. I think that's one of the things you were very blunt about. I was probably in a higher category of risk. I had high blood pressure, hypertension, pre-diabetic. How would you say I've progressed in the space of 6 weeks with pro-longevity?
Actually, the most important thing you didn't mention, which is sleep.
Hmm.
Because if we look at susceptibility to coronavirus, then what you want is the best possible immune system prepped up, raring to go. And actually, if you want to prep up your immune system, then it's completely free, of course. Get more sleep.
Hmm.
And among other things, you were suffering, and I think the prime cause of your suffering, if you like, was sleep. And once I kind of explained to you the importance of sleep, we're talking about this in the context of the immune system, but it's important in the context of all these diseases we worry about: pre-diabetes, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, dementia, has a fundamental effect. And quite rapidly, even before we started the program, you started to improve your sleep. And I could see a big change in you just from that.
Okay, so how concerned should we be and why about this current epidemic?
Well, it's early days. I think the concerns are probably as following, and I'm going to kind of compare and contrast with flu. Now, back in I think 1918, after the First World War, 50 million people died of flu. In fact, flu killed more people than the entire First World War. So that's what a really devastating virus can do. That's context. Now, that doesn't happen anymore. But what we do know is that seasonal flu kills around 625,000 people each year and about 25 to 30,000 people in the UK. So, in the context of that kind of number, and you look at the deaths of a few thousand people worldwide, you might say it's a storm in a teacup, but actually it's not. And I'll tell you why it's not a storm in a teacup. First of all, we understand flu. We've got very good metrics, and we can pretty much predict it year by year. Secondly, we've got the flu jab, and the flu jab, particularly in this country, has been fantastically effective. And I'm absolutely convinced the reason we're well overdue, actually, for a severe flu epidemic, but we haven't had one, I think, because we've got a combination of using the seasonal flu virus and something called herd immunity. Um, then we have to think about the fact that this is a new virus. We don't have the immunity, never mind herd immunity, which is a broad spread of immunity where we're not used to it. So our immune system hasn't had the chance to learn this virus and become immune to it and grow the antibodies. Now, in terms of how dangerous a virus is, there are two aspects to it: transmissibility and lethality. Don't worry about the technical language I'm using, but the point is this: how easy is it to catch, and how likely is it to kill you? Everyone concentrates on the how easy is it likely to kill you bit. Actually, that's in some ways less of a problem, because if everyone that gets coronavirus dies quickly, then it can't spread. The point about the coronavirus is, as I say, we don't have a jab for it. We haven't got immunity to it. It's highly transmissible. It looks like it's much easier, in fact, to catch coronavirus than seasonal flu. And the actual lethality, so the likelihood of it killing you, We're not quite sure, but the latest science seems to be that the death rate from seasonal flu is about 0.1%, whereas the death rate from coronavirus is 10 or 20 times higher than that. So if you put the combination of the fact it's easy to catch and quite lethal, that is why everyone's in meltdown, and that's why economies are being locked down. Because actually, if we allow it to get a grip, and it's spreading quite rapidly, then it could kill an awful lot of people and paralyze economies and health systems. So the answer is yes, we should take this very, very seriously. It is a real risk worldwide.
Okay, so I think there's been a lot of education in terms of people that are vulnerable that is very generic. And one of the things that you do is look after people that are diabetic. They seem to be the most vulnerable. Are there any other people that you would say are vulnerable, and what should they be doing to reduce their vulnerability apart from self-isolation?
Sure. So let me take that in two halves. The point about diabetes is, in general, people think about it as, and let's be clear, we're talking about type 2 diabetes, not type 1 diabetes. Mm-hmm. Type 2 diabetes is part of a cluster of diseases which is known as metabolic syndrome. Again, don't worry about the technical language, but there's a direct relationship between type 2 diabetes and prediabetes, hypertension, cancer, and dementia, and various other diseases. So my point is it's quite a profound risk, and it's quite far-reaching. Mm-hmm. If you've got type 2 diabetes, you have all sorts of additional vulnerabilities. Clearly, diabetics are vulnerable. And they always tend to be vulnerable to all sorts of long-term, all sorts of infections and conditions. Unusually for coronavirus, in this case, we're seeing a lot more problems with people with hypertension than we would normally predict. And we're not entirely sure why that is. It's probably something to do with how the virus actually enters the cell, and it enters through a particular receptor on the cell as it finds its way in. The overwhelming concern is always the elderly, so 70 plus. Then people who are both elderly and have long-term conditions, so respiratory conditions, because it's a respiratory virus, other long-term conditions that we generally know about, so cancer, type 2 diabetes, hypertension. So a combination of being both, and smoking, actually. Smoking is an independent high-risk factor. So if you've got one of these risk factors, that's a problem. If you've got several of them, and they do tend to be found in a cluster, then you're at much higher risk. So that's kind of putting the risk in context. And interestingly, again, a big difference with seasonal flu, it looks like babies don't generally get it, or if they do get it, in fact, they do get it, but they get no symptoms. Mm-hmm. And the same thing with young children. So, and nobody understands the dynamic here, but the very young, who you often think is more vulnerable, are susceptible to catching it, but they seem to get over it uneventfully with really mild symptoms. So it's older people, and particularly older people with other long-term conditions. So that's kind of a long answer to a short question, but I can't give you a simple answer to this. Okay. I think the second part of your question was, how can we protect ourselves?
Yeah, I think one of the things that you determined with me was I had high blood pressure and hypertension. I know what high blood pressure is, and I think a lot of people know the damage it can cause. What is hypertension, and would you say I'm no longer hypertension risk?
Yeah. So hypertension is just the technical term for raised blood pressure, right? Mm. Everyone has blood pressure. If you didn't have any pressure in your blood, you wouldn't be pumping anything around. So it's raised. It's blood pressure raised above normal, and you can have a debate about what normal is. We start to think about 140 over 90, but actually my target would probably be something like 130 over 80. Would be my ideal. As we know, your blood pressure was way higher than that. And as you said yourself, you were at the twin risk of a heart attack or a stroke. The next question is, what drives hypertension? Now, we talk about, in health professionals, we use the term essential hypertension, right? Crazy, right? 2 million years of evolution, and we're essentially hypertensive. I don't buy it, right? I think that's just a technical term for blood pressure that shouldn't be there, that we don't really understand the cause of. I reject that terminology entirely. And in fact, my view is that hypertension, raised blood pressure, unless proven otherwise, and there are other causes, but the major root cause of raised blood pressure is high insulin. Okay? So the next question is, what raises insulin? And the next question is, can I do anything about it? Right? So I look at your particular circumstances. Your diet wasn't great. Your alcohol consumption wasn't great. You weren't particularly exercising very well, and you were sleeping poorly. All these things tend to conspire to raise your blood glucose by various mechanisms. Because blood glucose has to be very tightly controlled, and the master hormone that controls blood glucose is insulin, the response to your raised blood glucose propensity, the fact that you were putting your whole system under this strain, was the body was chronically elevating your insulin. So whereas insulin should be low and pulsed, you had insulin up here, controlling everything, right? And the way I always explain it is, if you imagine you've got a lake of sugar and a dam of insulin, if you keep chucking more sugar into the lake, your body will generate more insulin. And if you're at the other side of the dam, everything looks kind of fine until one day your dam collapses. And that, going from there to there, is you've got type 2 diabetes. But that journey of getting to that collapse is a 5, 10, 15, 20-year journey. And you were on that journey at the kind of intermediate stage.
Yeah. And in terms of the way I've been treated, I've been put on medication. Let's just talk about the medication, because that's your specialty. You are a award-winning pharmacist. A lot of talk about things that if people have symptoms, they should or shouldn't take. Ibuprofen has been in the news. If I'm a blood pressure sufferer, what sort of medications might be helpful or not? What's the right course of action at the moment from a pharmacist point of view?
So the first thing is know your numbers, right? Anyone can go about a blood pressure monitor, buy one from a reputable source, and one that's got the kite mark on it. That's number one. Number two, and very few people know this, take your blood pressure in both arms and take it twice a day. Because blood pressure is very labile, right? And if your blood pressure at 2 o'clock in the afternoon when you go and see your GP is perfect, that's all the GP's got to go on. I always say to people, both arms, because if there's a big variation in both arms and different times of day, do it for a week. And then if your blood pressure is in the region or above the region of 140/90, take that data and show it to your GP, because then you're not showing him one single isolated reading, him or her, you're showing a pattern of blood pressure, right? So that's kind of defining blood pressure. And then the question is, what approach should we have to treating blood pressure? And the NHS approach, entirely reasonably, tends to be the use of medication. Now, there's a little bit of controversy at the moment around a particular group of drugs, which is one of the most common drugs that we use to treat blood pressure, called the ACE inhibitors. And most of them end in the word pril: enalapril, lisinopril, perindopril. Now, and again, this is a bit technical, but the receptor for these drugs is the same receptor that allows the coronavirus to enter the cell. These drugs block that receptor. So the initial reasonable thinking was that if you are blocking the receptor that allows the virus to enter the cell, it should reduce your risk of getting COVID-19, which is the disease that relates from that you get as a result of coronavirus infection. Actually, that doesn't seem to be the case, and the jury is very much out. And it may well be that when you block the receptor, you get more receptors, and more receptors means more entry points of the virus, right? So the debate going on at the moment, but the science at the moment is very unclear. And the one thing I do not want people to do is get a message that says, stop taking my antihypertensive medication. There is absolutely no evidence whatsoever to substantiate that. And it's unclear, in fact, whether the taking ramipril or one of the other prils is a risk, or in fact may be protective, right? Do not stop taking a blood pressure medication. Once the science is clear about this, it may well be that you will go back to your GP and your GP will review you, and they may or may not change your blood pressure medication. Do not stop taking the medication, because if the risk of not taking the medication is far, far higher than any risk from the disease. So there are 7 or 8 different options in terms of treating blood pressure. This is just one. It's a very good option. It's the option that probably most people take as the first choice. Most prescribers would use as the first or second in line. It's being used en masse. Don't stop taking it. Can I just come back to the OTC medication question that you asked earlier on?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah. So the first question is, should I take anything, right? And if you've got mild symptoms, I would say don't medicate. It's actually the body's natural response of raising the temperature of the body is part of a natural defense mechanism. And again, the science isn't exact, but unless you've got a temperature that is really causing you problems, or you've got a young child with a severe heat fever, if you can manage not to treat it, I would simply live with the symptoms and keep well hydrated, and don't take analgesics.
Yeah.
If your temperature is up beyond the point of being able to cope and you're really feeling miserable, the advice is paracetamol, not ibuprofen, and I'll explain why. If you're going to take paracetamol, you need to take 2 together, and you need to take 2 tablets 4 times a day, allowing between 4 to 6 hours between the doses. Right. A lot of people think, oh, paracetamol, it's in Lemsip, it's not very dangerous. Actually, that's not true. So paracetamol taken no more than 2 tablets 4 times a day is very effective. If you take less than that, it doesn't work very well. If you take more than that, it quite rapidly accumulates, and it's quite dangerous quite rapidly. So do not be cavalier and take overdose of paracetamol.
Okay.
For those people for whom paracetamol doesn't work, or for whom they have it's rare, but don't get on with paracetamol, they're allergic to it, then the second line is ibuprofen. But there's some limited evidence that ibuprofen, although it gives you symptomatic disease, might prolong or exacerbate the disease. So for most people, paracetamol is first line, ibuprofen is second line.
Perfect.
So that's the first point. I guess your second question is, if I'm not going down the medication route, or I want to lower my blood pressure by another means, are there lifestyle options available to me? Right. So let's just look at the lifestyle changes that you can make and how rapidly they might benefit you. So the things that you can do to lower your blood pressure, and these are not in order: get sleep, get 8.5 hours of good quality sleep, and really, really prioritize that. Okay. And people, including yourself, until I pointed this out to you, and in fact, me for much of my life, I always used to think that sleep was something you could do when you were dead, and the truth is you will be dead. So get sleep, right? The next thing is get some good, healthy exercise, and we can talk about that in greater detail. The third thing that I think is really important is to take 2 vitamins specifically that we tend to be lower on: vitamin D and magnesium, the right ones at the right dose, because we're designed to be in sunlight, and that's where we manufacture our vitamin D. But then fundamental importance is diet. And so a diet high in sugar and carbs and processed foods, so McDonald's, Pizza Hut and Doritos and anything that Kellogg's make, is going to pretty much guarantee to raise your sugar, which will raise your insulin, and in turn will raise your blood pressure. And I'm seeing this, actually, you can make these changes quite rapidly. So I'm seeing many clients who are in the early stages of hypertension, what we call pre-hypertension, and we can get them down to normal blood pressure levels within a month without the use of medication. And as you pointed out in previous videos, you went from what was a hypertensive crisis that required a hospital admission to not a single dose, but a double dose of your drug. But then with the changes that we've made, you're now on half the medication. You're on a very, very low dose of one drug. And I would hope that over the next month, we could get you off entirely. So actually, you can quite rapidly bring down your blood pressure. But one thing is really, really important. And I see so many people they're hypertensive, they don't take their medication, they're not making the lifestyle adjustments, they are at huge risk. And if you know, the highest risk that you can make, if you like, is smoking. Maybe the second higher risk is poor sleep. The third higher risk is having high blood pressure. Please, I know it's got no symptoms, don't ignore it.
Yeah, it's interesting that Wetherspoons have said they are going to stay open against government advice and have people sat at alternate tables. And McDonald's are going to continue to feed the nation by having drive-in service, and both are going to take the added precaution of using card payments only, so that they don't handle cash.
Yeah, so between McDonald's and Wetherspoons, they're going to guarantee that the nation continues to have diabetes and hypertension.
Yeah, and increase the risk
very altruistic of them.
Yeah, of actually succumbing. Okay, so finally, how well do you think preparations are going, and does...
Have we grossly mishandled this crisis? No, I don't think we have. Is every other country getting it absolutely right? No, it's not. Mm-hmm. The point about it is we're learning as we go. Unfortunately, because in China they initially disguised what was going on, they allowed it to get out of control. If you remember, they more or less circumscribed the doctor who first raised the warning, and I think it was a young guy who was 35 and he died of the infection. Interestingly, now China has gone the other way around. It's being very transparent, and it means that using AI and our medical knowledge, we can really model this disease. Mm-hmm. I think that by and large, the NHS has got it right, with one exception, which is testing and also how it's treating community pharmacies. So we'll maybe come back to that. The point is this, right? If the health system has capacity, then it will be able to cope with the people who get really sick, right? So the vast majority of people that have this disease, they get a cough and a fever and they don't feel very good for a few days and they get over it uneventfully. But it is a respiratory disease, so you can end up with acute respiratory distress. And because the virus, not exclusively, but primarily attacks the small spaces in the lungs. If 5% of those infected, which is about what we think it will be, become seriously ill, and all of that happens at once. So let's suppose 20, 30 million people have the disease and 5% of them get seriously ill, there's no way the system will cope. You might then think, okay, well, can we stop it dead in its tracks? No, we can't. Because we don't have a vaccine and because we don't have an immune system used to dealing with it, we're not going to stop it. So the whole strategy of the NHS is to delay the spread over a period of time, allow herd immunity that we have for other diseases to develop. But by delaying the peak, so instead of the peak going up like this and down like that, we spread the peak. And that means those 5% who need hospital admission and emergency care are spread over a period of time, which allows health systems to cope. And the longer that we can delay that spread and the broader we can spread it out, the better we've got within the NHS of A, building capacity, and B, coping with those people who need acute treatment. Mm-hmm. And this is where they've struggled in Italy, right? So the disease got out of control. In certain parts of Italy, they've had very high levels of disease. And even though it was only 5% of people who were very, very ill, that 5% of a lot of people is still a lot of people, and the health system couldn't cope. So that's what we've really learned from science so far is to slow the spread of disease, right? Because we can't stop it. And the various measures that the government have put into place are taking into account the rate of spread, the rate of doubling of the disease, and then you can mathematically model when the worst period is going to be. And we're probably 2 to 3 months away from the worst of the peak. We're about, I think, 2 to 3 weeks behind Spain and France, and maybe a month behind Italy. Italy shows what can happen if things go really wrong. So I think the NHS has got it pretty much right. It has to delay the spread, but we can't isolate the entire country for an indefinite period. A, the economy will collapse. B, people's morale will collapse. And C, once people start getting together again, the disease will just come back. So you're having to very carefully finesse medical advice, social care, people's social perspectives, their mental health, and the economy. And I think by and large, we've got this right. And I would encourage people to ignore what it says on Twitter, Go to the NHS website, rely on the website. It's very, very accurate and up to date, and I completely support what my colleagues in the NHS are doing.
Okay, so we'll put that website up right now. So it's www.nhs.uk/conditions/coronavirus-COVID-19.
Trips off the tongue, but we'll put it in the video.
They could have maybe worked on that, made it a bit shorter.
Oh, there we go. Where the NHS has got it wrong, I think, are in two particular areas. One is we're not doing enough testing. So if we don't test, we don't know where the disease is spreading. If we don't know where the disease is spreading, we don't know where to focus our attention.
Yeah.
And it's been shown throughout the world that where areas have done really bad was they didn't find the spread early enough. It got out of control, and then health systems, because it's not spreading equally nationwide. So we need to know where it's spreading rapidly, and then we need to concentrate both resource and social isolation in those areas. That's not happening. Although I hear an announcement today that they're going to increase testing, right? The second problem is, and this is unlike flu, health professionals are susceptible to the disease. No one quite knows why, but we suspect it's because of the level of exposure to the disease. So just when you need more doctors, help, pharmacists, nurses, health professionals, they get sick. So instead of being in the A&E treating you, they're in the A&E being treated by their colleagues. Not a good look. And testing is key here. Now, if you look at what's happened, they've GPs have shut their doors to walk-in services. And they're doing things by telephone triage and calling people in. That's entirely the right strategy to protect GPs and the rest of health professionals. But all of that is now spilling over to community pharmacies like mine. We are overwhelmed. We're not supported. We're not protected. We're not being helped by the NHS. We're coping with all of the fallout with none of the support. And I think this is grossly negligent to my profession, my pharmacy teams, and members of the public and the NHS. And this needs to be changed, and it needs to be changed urgently.
Well, on that note, I think we'll thank you and wish you the very best. Obviously, we all need to be wished the very best. I don't think anybody is in a particularly good position, young or old. But I think there are some very good bits of advice that should, in the short term, improve people's chances of getting through. So, okay. If anybody wants more information, I know you welcome people contacting you through ProLongevity. We'll put the website details up right now. And, you know, obviously, I think you can give people that are seriously concerned about their health, hypertension, blood pressure, etc., a consultation by video like we're doing now.
We can, but please, I'm not NHS 111. I haven't got the resources or the evidence base to the NHS.
Sure.
Please, in the first instance, if it's something specific to ProLongevity, do contact me. I'll always try to help. But phone NHS 111, look at the NHS website. You will get really good, reassuring, accurate, scientific, professional advice.
Yeah. And what you're really keen about are people that want to commit to a long-term lifestyle change. That's the purpose of ProLongevity.
Absolutely.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, great. Thanks on behalf of anybody who's watching this. We'll distribute it via various Facebook forums and hopefully have more information. I think you're doing a more detailed evidence-based blog, and we maybe can go through that.
I'm writing a blog, but I want to get it right, and I'd rather get it right in a few days than get it wrong now and do a new thing. Sure.
Brilliant. Okay, well, Graham, from myself, bye for now.
Cheers, John. Good to see you.